My name is Jake Morrison, and I'm a Chicago resident who survived the first 12 hours of the zombie outbreak that destroyed my city. When my sister Sarah sent me her final text from Northwestern Memorial Hospital saying patients were biting people, I thought she was joking. Within hours, I watched from my 18th floor apartment as the infected overran downtown Chicago during what should have been our biggest 4th of July celebration ever. I had to escape a city of 3 million people who were eating each other alive, and I'm going to tell you exactly how I did it. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Jake Morrison, and I lived in Chicago my entire life until the morning of July 2nd, 2022. I'm 28 years old, and I worked as a marketing coordinator for a tech startup downtown. I had a studio apartment on the 18th floor of a building in Lincoln Park, exactly 3 blocks from Northwestern Memorial Hospital. That proximity to the hospital would save my life, but it also meant I had a front row seat to watch my city die. I'm telling you this story because someone needs to know what really happened during those first 12 hours. The news reports. You might have seen the official government statements, the CDC briefings. They don't tell you the truth. They can't tell you what it was like to watch 3 million people turn into something else, something hungry. They can't describe the smell of smoke rising from downtown Chicago or the sound of a city eating itself alive. That Saturday morning started like any other weekend in July. I woke up around 7:30, made coffee, and checked my phone. Chicago was gearing up for what the mayor had promised would be the biggest 4th of July celebration in the city's history. Navy Pier was hosting a massive festival. Grant Park had concerts planned, and the fireworks display was supposed to be visible from every neighborhood. My friends and I had been planning to meet at Navy Pier that afternoon to watch the setup and grab some food before the crowds got too crazy. My sister Sarah was supposed to join us. She's 26, 2 years younger than me, and she worked as an e-nurse at Northwestern Memorial. She'd been picking up extra shifts all week because the hospital was paying holiday overtime, and she needed the money for her student loans. Sarah had always been the responsible one in our family, the one who became a nurse to help people while I pushed spreadsheets around for a living. I remember sitting at my kitchen counter, scrolling through social media while drinking my coffee. The morning light was streaming through my windows, and I could see the lake in the distance. It was going to be a perfect day for the festival. That's when I first saw the news alert on my phone. Mass food poisoning incident at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. 43 people hospitalized after Friday night fundraiser dinner. The timestamp said 6 o'clock in the morning, which meant it had been happening for over an hour before I even woke up. I felt a little worried about Sarah, but food poisoning happens. Hospitals deal with it all the time. I figured she was probably just having a busier morning than usual. But then I started paying attention to the details, and something felt wrong. The news kept using words like aggressive behavior and unexplained agitation. I'd never heard those terms used to describe food poisoning before. People with food poisoning are usually weak, nauseous, bedridden. They don't get agitated. They don't display aggressive behavior. Sarah had been complaining all week about how busy the hospital was. She said they were getting weird cases from some of the smaller towns outside Chicago. People coming in with symptoms that didn't match any standard diagnosis. Fever, confusion, and what she called extreme irritability. The doctors were running tests, but nothing was coming back with clear results. She mentioned towns like Rockford, Joliet, even someplace in Wisconsin. All similar cases, all within the past 2 weeks. I should have paid more attention to what she was telling me. I should have asked more questions. But I was focused on my own life, my own plans, my own problems. I had no idea those smaller town incidents were connected to what was about to happen in Chicago. By 9 o'clock, I was getting ready to shower when my phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Work is insane today. Can't meet for lunch. Something weird happening here. I texted back asking if she was okay, but she didn't respond right away. That wasn't unusual. Sarah's shifts were always hectic, and she often couldn't check her phone for hours at a time. I went ahead and showered, got dressed, and started planning my day. I was supposed to meet my friends at Navy Pier around 2 o'clock. Mike was driving in from Schaumburg, and Tom was coming from the south side. We'd been looking forward to this weekend for months. The whole city had been talking about the celebration. Hotels were booked solid, restaurants had special menus planned, and the mayor had been doing interviews all week about how this was going to put Chicago on the map for tourism. While I was getting ready, I kept the news on in the background. That's when I noticed the numbers changing. The initial report said 43 people hospitalized. By 9:30, it was 87. By 10 o'clock, it was 123. Food poisoning outbreaks don't usually escalate that quickly. Even the worst cases might affect 50 or 60 people at most. I walked over to my window and looked down toward the hospital. From my 18th floor apartment, I could see the emergency room entrance clearly. There were ambulances lined up like I'd never seen before. The parking lot was full of vehicles with flashing lights. Police cars, fire trucks, ambulances, and some vehicles I didn't recognize. White vans with government plates. That's when I started taking photos with my phone. I don't know why I did it. Maybe some instinct told me I was witnessing something important. Maybe I wanted to show my friends later. But I'm glad I did, because those photos are some of the only documentation of how quickly everything fell apart. At 10:30, Sarah texted me again. They're bringing in CDC people. We're not supposed to talk about patients. This message worried me more than the first one. The CDC doesn't get involved in routine food poisoning cases. They only show up when something is spreading, when something is dangerous, when something is beyond local control. I tried calling her, but it went straight to voicemail. The hospital probably had a policy about personal phone calls during emergencies. I left a message asking her to call me when she could, told her I was worried, and that I loved her. I wish I'd said more. I wish I'd told her to get out of there while she still could. By 11 o'clock, I was glued to the news. Every local channel was covering the story. The numbers kept climbing. 156 people hospitalized. Then 193. Then 227. The reporters were using terms like unprecedented and emergency protocols. They kept interviewing hospital administrators who looked stressed and confused. But the most disturbing part was what they weren't saying. No one was explaining what kind of food poisoning causes aggressive behavior. No one was describing the specific symptoms. No one was showing any footage from inside the hospital. Everything was vague, carefully worded, controlled. Someone was managing the information, and that someone didn't want the public to know the truth. I started checking social media for more details. Twitter was full of posts from people claiming to have friends or family at Northwestern Memorial. The stories were bizarre. People talking about patients attacking medical staff. Videos of emergency room chaos that got taken down almost immediately. Posts about hospital lockdown procedures. That disappeared within minutes of being uploaded. One post stuck with me. It was from a user claiming to be a hospital security guard. He wrote, "The sick people aren't acting sick. They're acting angry. They're acting hungry. Management told us to delete our social media and not talk to anyone about what we're seeing. Something is very wrong here." The post was deleted before. I could screenshot it, but I remembered every word. At 12:30, I saw the first military vehicles. National Guard trucks rolling down Michigan Avenue, heading toward downtown. Big green vehicles with soldiers in the back. That's when I knew this wasn't just a food poisoning outbreak. The military doesn't respond to medical emergencies unless those emergencies threaten public safety on a massive scale. I called my mom in Naperville to check on her. She was fine, hadn't heard about any problems in her area. I told her about the situation downtown and suggested she stay home for the day. She laughed and said I was being paranoid. She was planning to come into the city later to watch the fireworks. I made her promise to wait until I called her again before leaving her house. I should have been more insistent. I should have driven out there and brought her to safety myself. At 1:15, Sarah texted me again, "Jake, I'm scared. The sick people, they're different. Stay away from downtown." This message made my blood run cold. Sarah wasn't someone who's scared easily. She'd been working in emergency medicine for 3 years. She'd seen everything from car accidents to drug overdoses to domestic violence cases. If something was scaring her, it was serious. I tried calling her immediately, but the call wouldn't go through. All circuits busy. I tried texting back, but the message showed as undelivered. The cell towers were getting overloaded. Too many people trying to communicate at once. Too many emergency calls flooding the system. From my window, I could see crowds gathering in the streets. People were starting to panic. Some were trying to get closer to the hospital to check on family members. Others were loading cars and trying to leave the city. Traffic was backing up on Lake Shore Drive. The normal flow of weekend activity was turning into something chaotic and desperate. At 1:45, I saw the CDC containment tents being set up in the hospital parking lot. Big white structures that looked like something from a disaster movie. Teams of people in hazmat suits moving equipment. This was when I realized we were dealing with something infectious, something that could spread from person to person. I kept thinking about the smaller towns Sarah had mentioned. Rockford, Joliet, places in Wisconsin. What if those cases weren't isolated incidents? What if they were part of a pattern? What if whatever was happening in Chicago had been building for weeks, spreading slowly through the region before exploding in our city? At 2:47 in the afternoon, I received the last text message I would ever get from my sister. "Don't come downtown. Something's wrong with the patients. They're biting people. I'm hiding in supply closet on 4th floor. Tell Mom I love her." I stared at that message for a full minute, reading it over and over. Biting people. Patients don't bite medical staff. Confused patients might grab or push, but they don't bite. Animals bite. Predators bite. Things that are hungry bite. I tried calling her 50 times in the next hour. Every call went straight to voicemail. I sent dozens of text messages that showed as undelivered. I even tried calling the hospital directly. But their main number was busy. I was completely cut off from any information about what was happening to my sister. That's when I made the decision that probably saved my life. I was going to drive to the hospital and find Sarah myself. I grabbed my keys, my phone charger, and some cash. I put on my best pair of running shoes and a jacket with deep pockets. I didn't pack a bag because I thought I'd be coming back home with Sarah in a few hours. I was about to leave my apartment when I heard the first scream from the hallway outside. My door, not a shout, not a yell, but a genuine scream of terror. The kind of sound that makes your whole body freeze, because you know someone is in mortal danger. I stopped with my hand on the doorknob and listened. The scream came again, closer. This time. Then I heard other sounds, thumping, crashing, the sound of someone running, the sound of someone falling, the sound of someone begging for help. I looked through the peephole in my door, and what I saw changed everything. Mrs. Chun from apartment 18B was on top of Mr. Rodriguez from 18C. She was biting his neck while he tried to push her away. There was blood everywhere. Mrs. Chun was 73 years old, a retired librarian who made cookies for everyone in the building at Christmas. But what I was watching through that peephole wasn't Mrs. Chun anymore. The thing that used to be Mrs. Chun looked up from Mr. Rodriguez's neck and turned toward my door. Her eyes were completely white, no pupils visible. Dark veins were visible under her pale skin. When she opened her mouth, I could see that her teeth were covered in blood. That's when I heard the scratching at my door, and I knew I was no longer planning a rescue mission to save my sister. I was fighting for my own survival, and my apartment building had become a trap. The scratching at my door started soft, almost like a cat trying to get inside, but I knew it wasn't a cat. I just watched Mrs. Chun, a woman who used to bring me homemade soup when I was sick, tear open Mr. Rodriguez's throat with her teeth. The sound got louder, more insistent, like fingernails dragging across wood. Then it became pounding. I stepped back from the door and tried to think. My apartment was on the 18th floor. The only way out was through that door, down the elevator or stairs, and through the lobby. But Mrs. Chun was right outside, and from the sounds in the hallway, she wasn't alone anymore. I could hear voices, but they weren't normal voices. They were making sounds like animals, growling and snarling. I grabbed my kitchen table and dragged it against the door. Then I pushed my couch against the table. The pounding got stronger, and I could hear the wood starting to splinter. My door wasn't meant to keep out someone who didn't care about getting hurt. It was just a standard apartment door with a basic lock. While I was moving furniture, I tried calling 911 on my phone. Busy signal. I tried again. Busy signal. On the third try, I got through to an automated message saying all emergency operators were busy and to stay on the line. I stayed on the line for 20 minutes before giving up. Whatever was happening was bigger than just my building. I tried calling Sarah again, straight to voicemail. I tried calling my mom. The call wouldn't connect. I tried calling my friend Mike, who was supposed to meet me at Navy Pier. No answer. The cell towers were either overloaded or going down completely. That's when I opened my laptop and started looking at social media. What I found there made everything clear. This wasn't just happening at Northwestern Memorial Hospital anymore. Posts were coming in from all over Chicago. Videos from the South Side showing people attacking each other in the streets. Photos from the North Side of abandoned police cars and emergency vehicles. Reports from the West Side of entire blocks going silent. I found a video posted 30 minutes earlier by someone calling themselves Chicago Nurse 47. The video was shaky, obviously filmed on a phone, and it showed the inside of what looked like a hospital emergency room. There were people lying on gurneys, but they weren't lying still. They were thrashing around, trying to bite anyone who came near them. Medical staff were running around in panic. You could hear someone screaming in the background about containment protocols failing. The video cut off abruptly, and when I tried to refresh the page, it was gone. Deleted. But I'd seen enough. Whatever had started with that fundraiser dinner on Friday night was spreading fast, and it was turning people into something that wasn't human anymore. I kept scrolling through social media, looking for more information. There were posts about similar incidents in other cities. Detroit was reporting problems at 3 hospitals. Milwaukee had issued a citywide emergency alert. Indianapolis was under some kind of quarantine. I started thinking about what Sarah had told me about those smaller towns. Rockford, Joliet, places in Wisconsin. Those hadn't been isolated incidents. They'd been the beginning. Someone had posted a shaky cell phone video from Rockford dated 3 days ago. It showed people stumbling through the downtown area, but they weren't walking normally. They were moving like they were drunk or confused, but their movements were aggressive. The person filming was whispering, trying not to attract attention. The video showed one of the confused people suddenly sprint toward a car and start pounding on the windows. The video ended when the person filming started running. That video had been posted 3 days ago, and now the same thing was happening in Chicago. Whatever this was, it had been building for at least a week. The government had to know about it. The CDC had to know about it, but they weren't warning people. They were trying to contain information while the infection spread. The pounding. On my door stopped suddenly, and I heard different sounds in the hallway. More voices, but these were normal human voices. My neighbors were trying to figure out what was happening. I could hear Mrs. Patterson from 18A asking if anyone had seen Mrs. Chun. I could hear the college kids from 18D arguing about whether they should call the police. I wanted to open my door and warn them, but I was afraid. What if Mrs. Chun was still out there, just waiting? What if there were more infected people in the hallway? I decided to stay barricaded and keep gathering information. I found a Twitter thread from someone claiming to be a CDC researcher. The thread was posted 2 hours ago, but it was already being deleted in real time. I managed to screenshot parts of it before it disappeared. The researcher was saying that the pathogen was transmitted through bites and blood contact. Incubation time was 15 to 45 minutes, depending on the location of the bite and the victim's immune system. Once infected, subjects lost higher brain function but retained motor skills and predatory instincts. The thread also mentioned that the pathogen might be airborne in later stages of infection. That detail made my stomach drop. If it became airborne, nowhere would be safe. You couldn't barricade yourself against something you breathed. I kept looking for more information, but posts were being deleted faster than I could read them. Someone was working very hard to control what information got out to the public. Government agencies, social media companies. Someone with a lot of power was trying to manage the narrative while people were dying. Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I heard breaking glass from somewhere else in the building. Then more screaming. Then what sounded like people running up and down the stairwells. The infection was spreading through my building floor by floor. I looked out my window toward downtown Chicago. There were fires burning in several locations. Smoke was rising from the direction of Navy Pier, where I was supposed to meet my friends. Emergency vehicles were everywhere, but they weren't moving in organized patterns anymore. They were scattered, abandoned, crashed into each other and into buildings. The lake was full of boats. People were trying to escape the city by water. Cars were backed up on every highway leading out of Chicago. Lakeshore Drive looked like a parking lot. People were abandoning their vehicles and walking, carrying suitcases and children. I tried to call my mom again. This time the call connected, but she didn't answer. It rang and rang before going to voicemail. I left a message telling her to get out of Naperville, to drive west toward Iowa, to get as far from Chicago as possible. I told her I loved her and that I would find her somehow. Around 5 o'clock, the power in my building started flickering. The lights would go out for a few seconds, then come back on. The internet was getting slower and more unreliable. I realized that the infrastructure of the city was starting to collapse. Power grids, communication networks, emergency services, everything was failing at once. I started taking inventory of what I had in my apartment. Half a box of cereal, 3 bottles of water, some crackers, a bag of pretzels, 2 cans of soup, and a jar of peanut butter. If I was careful, I might have enough food for 3 days, but water was going to be a problem. If the power went out completely, the water pumps would stop working. I also looked at what I could use as weapons. A kitchen knife, a baseball bat I kept by my bed, a hammer from my toolbox. I'd never been in a fight in my life, but I was starting to understand that I might have to defend myself. Around 6 o'clock, I heard voices in the hallway again. This time they sounded organized. Someone was trying to coordinate with the other tenants, trying to figure out a plan. I could hear Mr. Johnson from 18F talking about getting everyone together and making it to the parking garage. I could hear the college kids agreeing to help. I was torn between joining them and staying hidden. A group might be safer, but a group would also be slower and louder. A group would attract more attention from the infected. I decided to listen and see what they were planning before making a decision. Through my door, I could hear Mr. Johnson explaining that he'd been in contact with his brother who worked for the city. The brother had told him that the military was setting up evacuation points outside the city. If people could get to those points, they might be able to get to safety. But they had to move soon, because the military was planning something called a containment protocol. I didn't like the sound of containment protocol. It sounded like military language for destroying everything inside a certain area to prevent something from spreading. If that was true, then staying in my apartment meant dying when whatever they were planning happened. The group in the hallway was getting ready to move. I could hear them gathering supplies and weapons. Part of me wanted to join them, but I kept thinking about Mrs. Chun. She'd been a normal person just hours ago. Now she was something that attacked and bit people. How many others in the building were infected? How could we tell who was safe and who wasn't? I made the decision to stay in my apartment for now. I would monitor the situation and see what happened to the group. If they made it out safely, I might follow their route. If something happened to them, I'd know not to try that path. Around 7 o'clock, I heard the group leaving. Footsteps in the hallway, people talking in whispers, the sound of the stairwell door opening and closing. Then silence. I waited by my door, listening for any indication of what was happening to them. 20 minutes later, I heard screaming from the stairwell. It lasted for about 10 minutes, then stopped abruptly. I never heard the voices of my neighbors again. Whatever had happened to them in that stairwell, they weren't coming back. The sun was starting to set, and I realized I was completely alone in my building. Everyone else was either dead, infected, or had fled. The power was still flickering, but it was getting worse. Soon I would be sitting in darkness on the 18th floor of a building full of infected people. I kept monitoring social media, but there were fewer and fewer posts. Either people weren't able to post anymore, or the platforms were shutting down. The last coherent news report I saw was from a station in Milwaukee. The reporter was saying that Chicago was under complete quarantine, and that similar quarantines were being established around Detroit, Indianapolis, and 3 cities in Wisconsin. That's when I found a post that changed everything. Someone had uploaded a document that looked like it came from a government agency. The document was dated 1 week ago, before any of this started happening publicly. It was a contingency plan for containing a biological outbreak in major metropolitan areas. It mentioned target cities, infection vectors, and timeline projections. Chicago was on the list. So were Detroit, Milwaukee, Indianapolis, and about 15 other cities. The document suggested that whoever wrote it knew this was going to happen. Not might happen, would happen. Someone had planned this. I screenshotted the document before it was deleted. But I couldn't make sense of all the technical language. What I could understand was terrifying. This wasn't a natural outbreak. This wasn't an accident. Someone had deliberately released something in multiple cities, and they'd been planning it for months. Around 8 o'clock, the power went out completely. My apartment was dark, except for the glow from my phone and laptop. Outside, most of the city was dark too. A few buildings still had emergency lighting, but the street lights were out. The traffic lights were out. Chicago was going black. I could hear sounds from other parts of the building. Scratching, pounding, things being dragged across floors. The infected were moving through the building, and there were more of them now. Either they'd found ways inside, or more residents had been infected and turned. I realized I needed to make a decision soon. I could stay in my apartment and hope the military would rescue me. But that containment protocol Mr. Johnson mentioned made me think rescue wasn't what they had planned. I could try to escape the building and make it to one of those evacuation points, but that meant going through hallways and stairwells full of infected people. My phone battery was at 30% and my laptop was at 20%. Soon I would lose my connection to the outside world. I would be alone in the dark with no information about what was happening. I started thinking about my grandmother. She'd lived through the Great Depression and World War II. She used to tell me stories about surviving disasters by staying calm and waiting for the right moment to act. Sometimes the safest path is the one that looks the most dangerous, she used to say. Looking out my window at the burning city below, I started to understand what she meant. The safe choice was to stay barricaded in my apartment. But the safe choice might also be the choice that got me killed when the military implemented their containment protocol. Around 9 o'clock, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Someone was trying to break down my door. The pounding on my door wasn't like Mrs. Chun's scratching from earlier. This was deliberate, organized, like someone was using their whole body as a battering ram. The furniture I'd stacked against the door started sliding backward with each impact. My kitchen table scraped across the floor. My couch shifted inch by inch. I grabbed my baseball bat and backed toward the window. In the darkness of my apartment, I could see cracks of light around the doorframe where the wood was starting to splinter. Whatever was outside had been human once, but it was stronger now. It didn't care about pain or injury. It just wanted to get inside. The pounding stopped suddenly, and I heard multiple voices in the hallway. Not the growling and snarling I'd heard before, but actual coordination. They were working together, planning something. I realized the infected weren't just mindless predators. They were learning, adapting, becoming more dangerous. That's when I heard the sound of metal on metal. Someone was trying to pick my lock. The infected had retained enough motor function to use tools, to problem solve. Mrs. Chun had been a librarian, but whoever was outside my door now had been someone who knew how to break into locked rooms. I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of waiting for them to break through my defenses, I was going to create a distraction and try to escape through the building. My grandmother always said that sometimes you have to run toward danger to get away from it. I opened my laptop and turned the volume all the way up. Then I played the loudest video I could find and placed the laptop near my bedroom window. The sound would draw the infected away from my door and toward the back of my apartment. While they were distracted, I would remove my barricade and try to reach the stairwell. The plan worked better than I expected. The pounding on my door stopped immediately, and I could hear movement in the hallway. Footsteps running toward the other end of the building, probably trying to find a way to reach the source of the sound. I had maybe 2 minutes before they figured out the trick. I moved my furniture away from the door as quietly as possible. The kitchen table was heavy, and dragging it across the floor made noise, but I had no choice. I grabbed my phone, my keys, and the baseball bat. I left everything else behind because I needed to move fast. When I opened my door, the hallway was empty but covered in blood. The carpet was dark and wet. There were handprints on the walls where people had tried to steady themselves while running. The emergency lighting was flickering, casting weird shadows that made everything look like a horror movie. I could see Mr. Rodriguez's body near the elevator. Mrs. Chun was nowhere in sight, but there was a trail of blood leading toward the stairwell. I realized she'd been dragging other victims to a central location, like an animal bringing prey back to its den. The stairwell door was propped open with someone's shoe. I could hear movement below me, multiple sets of footsteps on concrete stairs. The infected were using the stairwells to move between floors, hunting in packs. But I also heard something else, human voices. Real human voices calling for help. I made another decision that could have gotten me killed. Instead of trying to escape immediately, I was going to help whoever was still alive in my building. Maybe it was stupidity, maybe it was conscience, but I couldn't just run while people were dying. I started climbing up instead of down. The stairwell above the 18th floor was empty, and I could move quickly. My plan was to reach the roof, and then figure out how to help the survivors below. From the roof, I might be able to see escape routes or signal for help. But when I reached the 20th floor, I found 3 people huddled in the stairwell landing. An elderly couple I recognized from the lobby and a young woman with a baby. They were terrified, whispering to each other about what they'd seen. The woman with the baby was crying silently, trying not to make noise. The elderly man was named Frank, and his wife was Margaret. They lived on the 10th floor and had been trying to reach the parking garage when they encountered infected. On the stairwell, the young woman was Lisa, and her baby was maybe 6 months old. She lived on the 19th floor and had been trapped when infected broke into her hallway. Frank had a small emergency radio, the kind people keep for power outages. He was scanning through frequencies, trying to find official information. Most channels were either dead air or automated emergency messages telling people to shelter in place. But we did pick up some fragmentary communications between emergency responders. What we heard was terrifying. The infection had spread to every neighborhood in Chicago. Emergency services were overwhelmed and falling back to defensive positions. The military was establishing a perimeter around the entire city. No one was getting in or out without military authorization. Lisa asked me if I knew what was causing the infection. I told her about the government document I'd seen online about how this seemed to be planned rather than accidental. Frank said he'd been a city engineer for 30 years, and he'd never seen infrastructure fail this quickly without deliberate sabotage. We were sharing information when we heard footsteps below us. Slow, deliberate footsteps climbing the stairs. Someone was coming up from the lower floors, and from the sound of their movement, it wasn't human anymore. The infected had found our stairwell. I told the group we needed to keep moving up. The roof was only 2 floors above us, and from there we might be able to move between buildings. Frank said he was too old to climb on rooftops, but I convinced him that staying in the stairwell meant dying. When we reached the roof access door, it was locked. The building management kept it locked to prevent people from accessing the roof without permission. But desperate times called for desperate measures. I used my baseball bat to break the glass panel next to the door and reached through to unlock it from the inside. The Chicago skyline from the rooftop was unlike anything I'd ever seen. The city was dark, but there were fires burning everywhere. Smoke was rising from dozens of locations. Emergency vehicles were scattered throughout the streets, many of them abandoned or crashed. The lake was full of boats, some moving, some drifting empty. Frank's radio picked up clearer signals from the roof. We heard military communications about establishing checkpoints and implementing something called Operation Clean Slate. The military was planning to sanitize downtown Chicago starting at dawn. Sanitize was a euphemism, but we all understood what it meant. Lisa started crying when she realized they were planning to destroy the city. Her parents lived in Wicker Park. Her brother worked downtown. Everyone she knew was somewhere in the area the military was planning to sanitize. Margaret held her while she cried, but I could see the fear in the older woman's eyes too. I looked at the other buildings around us. Some were taller, some were shorter, but several had rooftops that were close enough to reach with a running jump. If we could make it to a building farther from downtown, we might be able to escape the sanitization zone before the military operation started. Frank pointed out that moving between buildings was dangerous, especially with a baby. But staying in our building was certain death. The infected were still in the stairwells below us, and they would eventually find a way to the roof. The military sanitization would kill everyone still in the downtown area, infected or not. We decided to try moving to the building next to ours. It was about 6 feet away and 1 floor lower. A dangerous jump, but not impossible. I would go first to test the route, then help the others across. The jump was terrifying. 6 feet doesn't sound like much when you're standing on solid ground, but when you're 18 floors above the street, it feels like a canyon. I made it across, but barely. The edge of the other building was crumbling concrete, and I almost didn't get a good grip. Frank came next, and I helped pull him across. He was breathing hard and shaking, but he made it. Margaret was next, and she was more agile than I expected. Lisa was last, and she was carrying the baby. That jump took all of our combined effort, but we got both of them safely across. From the second building, we could see more of the city. The infection wasn't contained to downtown anymore. There were fires and chaos in every direction. The south side, the north side, even some of the suburbs were showing signs of breakdown. This wasn't just a Chicago problem anymore. We kept moving from building to building, trying to get farther from the downtown core. Some jumps were easier than others. Some buildings had fire escapes or maintenance ladders that made crossing safer, but each move was dangerous, especially for Frank and Margaret. On the fourth building, we found other survivors. A small group had barricaded themselves on the roof and were trying to signal for help with flashlights. There were 7 of them, including 2 children. They'd been trapped since the afternoon and were running out of water. The group had a better radio than Frank's, and they'd been monitoring multiple channels. They'd heard the same military communications we had, but they'd also picked up civilian radio traffic. There were survivor groups forming throughout the city. People were organizing, sharing information, trying to help each other. But they'd also heard something that chilled all of us. The infection was spreading beyond Chicago. Detroit was completely dark. Milwaukee had gone silent. Indianapolis was under military quarantine. Cities in Wisconsin, Iowa, and Indiana were reporting similar outbreaks. One of the survivors was a nurse from a different hospital than Sarah. She'd seen the early stages of the infection and understood how it worked. The pathogen attacked the brainstem first, shutting down higher cognitive functions while leaving motor skills intact. Victims retained muscle memory and basic instincts, but they lost empathy, reasoning, and impulse control. She also confirmed what I'd suspected about transmission. Bites were the primary vector, but blood contact could also spread the infection. In later stages, some victims seemed to be able to spread it through respiratory droplets. The incubation time varied from 15 minutes to several hours depending on the victim's immune system and the location of exposure. The nurse said something that made me think about Sarah. Medical personnel were especially vulnerable because they were exposed to multiple infected patients. Even with protective equipment, the risk was enormous. If Sarah had been in the emergency room when the first wave of infected arrived, she probably didn't survive the first few hours. We spent several hours on that rooftop, sharing information and planning our next move. The military sanitization was scheduled to begin at dawn, which gave us maybe 4 hours to get out of the downtown area. But traveling at night was dangerous, because the infected seemed to be more active after dark. Frank's radio picked up a transmission from someone claiming to be with an organized survivor group. They had established a safe zone about 20 miles west of the city and were trying to guide other survivors to their location. The transmission included detailed directions and warnings about areas to avoid. But the transmission also included information that made me understand the true scope of what was happening. The survivor group had been in contact with similar groups in other states. The infection wasn't limited to the Midwest. There were reports of outbreaks on both coasts, in the South, and in parts of Canada and Mexico. Someone had coordinated this attack on a continental scale. Multiple cities had been hit simultaneously with the same bioweapon. This wasn't a random outbreak or an accident. This was warfare, and someone was trying to destroy civilization itself. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, we heard helicopters approaching. Military aircraft with searchlights, flying low over the downtown area. They weren't looking for survivors. They were conducting reconnaissance for the sanitization operation. One helicopter hovered directly over our building for several minutes. The searchlight swept across the roof, and we all held our breath. If they saw us, would they rescue us or mark us as targets for elimination? We pressed ourselves against the roof access structure and waited. The helicopter moved on without acknowledging our presence. Either they hadn't seen us or they had orders not to extract civilians from the sanitization zone. Both possibilities were terrifying. That's when I made the decision that would determine whether I lived or died in the next few hours. I was going to leave the group and try to reach my car in the parking garage. Alone, I could move faster and take more risks. With the group, especially with elderly people and a baby, we would never make it out of the city before the military operation began. I explained my plan to the others. Frank argued that we should stick together, but Lisa understood. She had a baby to protect, and my plan was too dangerous for a child. Margaret just nodded and wished me luck. The nurse gave me some basic medical supplies and advice about avoiding infection. As I prepared to leave the rooftop and begin my descent toward street level, I took one last look at the Chicago skyline. The city where I'd lived my entire life was dying. In a few hours, it would be gone completely. I had to accept that Sarah was dead, that my friends were probably dead, that the life I'd known was over forever. But I also had to accept something else. Whatever had happened here was happening everywhere. The world I was trying to escape might not exist anymore. I might be running from one disaster toward another even worse disaster. The last thing I heard on Frank's radio before I left the rooftop was a transmission from someone claiming to be with the federal government. The voice said that Operation Clean Slate was just the beginning. Phase 2 would begin once the urban centers were cleared. They were going to rebuild society from scratch, but only certain people would be included in the new world. I started my descent toward the street level, knowing that I was about to discover what those words really meant. Getting down from the rooftop to street level was harder than climbing up had been. I had to move through multiple buildings, using fire escapes and maintenance access points. Every floor I descended brought me closer to the infected who were moving through the lower levels of these buildings like predators hunting prey. The first building I entered through a rooftop access door had been an office complex. The hallways were dark except for emergency lighting that cast long shadows. Everywhere, I could hear movement in some of the offices, scratching sounds and muffled voices that didn't sound quite human anymore. I moved as quietly as possible, but every step seemed to echo in the empty corridors. On the 12th floor, I encountered my first infected person since leaving my apartment building. It had been a security guard, based on the uniform, but now it was standing motionless in the middle of the hallway, like it was waiting for something. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and when it heard my footsteps, it turned toward me with movements that were too fast and too fluid. I backed into the nearest office and closed the door. The infected guard started pounding on the door immediately, but I'd learned from my apartment that doors wouldn't hold them for long. I looked around the office for another exit and found a window that opened onto a fire escape. The fire escape was rusty and made noise with every step, but it was better than being trapped in an office with an infected guard. I climbed down 3 floors before the fire escape ended at a small balcony. From there, I had to jump to the fire escape of the adjacent building. That jump was worse than the rooftop jumps because I was exhausted and scared. I barely made it, and the impact sent vibrations through the metal structure that probably alerted every infected person in a 2-block radius to my location. I had to move faster. The second building was a residential complex, and it was full of infected. I could hear them moving through the hallways on every floor. Some were alone, wandering aimlessly. Others seemed to be moving in groups, coordinating their search patterns. The infection had changed them, but it hadn't made them stupid. I made it down to the 6th floor before I encountered a group of 3 infected people blocking the stairwell. They weren't attacking each other, which confirmed what the nurse on the rooftop had told me. The infected could recognize each other and work together. They were becoming a new kind of predator, one that could plan and coordinate. I had to backtrack and find another route down. I used an elevator shaft, climbing down the cables like they do in movies. It was terrifying and dangerous, but it got me past the infected in the stairwell. My hands were raw and bleeding by the time I reached the 3rd floor, but I was almost to street level. The ground floor of the building was a lobby with large windows facing the street. I could see outside for the first time since leaving the rooftop. The streets were full of abandoned cars, crashed emergency vehicles, and bodies. But there were also infected people moving through the area in organized groups. I watched them for several minutes, trying to understand their behavior patterns. They seemed to be searching buildings systematically, like they were looking for survivors. When they found empty buildings, they moved on quickly. When they found buildings with people inside, they surrounded those buildings and waited. My apartment building was 3 blocks away, and my car was in the parking garage underneath it. Getting there meant crossing 3 blocks of open street while avoiding multiple groups of infected. I needed a plan that would get me across that distance without attracting attention. I decided to move through the buildings instead of the streets. Many of the ground floor businesses had connecting doors or shared walls that I could break through. It would be slower than running directly to my destination, but it would keep me hidden from the infected groups outside. The first building I entered was a coffee shop that connected to a bookstore. Both businesses were empty, but there were signs of struggle. Overturned tables, broken windows, bloodstains on the floor. The infected had been through here, but they'd moved on to areas with more activity. I found a connecting door between the bookstore and a clothing shop next door. The door was locked, but I used my baseball bat to break it open. The clothing shop connected to a small restaurant, which connected to another office building. I was making progress, but each building had its own dangers. In the restaurant, I found a survivor hiding in the kitchen. She was maybe 60 years old, and she'd been trapped there since the afternoon. She begged me to help her get out of the city, but I had to make a hard choice. Taking her with me would slow me down and increase the chances that both of us would die. I gave her directions to the rooftop survivor group I'd left earlier, but I couldn't take her with me. She called me a coward as I left, and she was probably right. But I'd learned that survival sometimes meant making choices that haunted you forever. The office building was the most dangerous part of my route. It was full of infected who had been office workers just hours earlier. They were still wearing business clothes, but they moved like animals hunting prey. I had to climb through ventilation shafts to avoid them, crawling through metal ducts that were barely wide enough for my body. When I finally emerged from the office building, I was only 1 block from my apartment complex. But that last block was the most dangerous part of the journey. There was no way to avoid the open street, and there were infected groups patrolling the area. I waited in the doorway of a pharmacy until I saw an opportunity. A helicopter flew over the area, and all the infected looked up to watch it. While they were distracted, I ran across the street and into the lobby of my apartment building. The lobby was a disaster zone. The security desk was overturned, the elevators were broken, and there was blood everywhere. But there were also signs that other tenants had made it to the parking garage. I could see a trail of footprints leading toward the garage entrance. The parking garage was underground, which meant it was dark and full of hiding places for infected. But it also meant I was protected from the military helicopters that were increasing their surveillance flights. I had to use my phone's flashlight to navigate, which was risky because light would attract infected, but I couldn't move safely in complete darkness. My car was on the 3rd level of the garage, and I had to check every corner and hiding spot. As I descended, the garage was full of abandoned vehicles where people had tried to escape but been caught by infected. Some cars had broken windows and bloodstains. Others had bodies inside. When I reached my car, I almost cried with relief. It was undamaged, and I still had the keys. But when I tried to start it, nothing happened. The battery was dead. I'd left the headlights on when I parked it 3 days earlier, and the battery had drained completely. I needed jumper cables and another vehicle with a working battery. There were dozens of cars in the garage, but most of them had been abandoned with their doors open and their batteries drained too. I had to search through multiple levels of the garage before I found a car that still had power. The process of jump-starting my car took about 20 minutes, and it made noise that echoed through the entire garage. I was terrified that the sound would attract infected, but I had no choice. Without the car, I would never make it out of the city before the military sanitization began. Finally, my engine turned over and started running. I had never been so happy to hear a car engine in my life. But when I tried to drive toward the garage exit, I discovered another problem. The exit was blocked by abandoned vehicles that had crashed into each other when their drivers tried to escape. I had to ram my car through the blockage, using the weight and momentum of my vehicle to push the abandoned cars out of the way. The impacts damaged my car's front end and broke one of my headlights, but I managed to clear a path to the street. Driving through downtown Chicago was like driving through a war zone. Every street had abandoned vehicles, debris, and bodies. I had to weave around obstacles constantly, and several times I had to reverse and find alternate routes when roads were completely blocked. The infected noticed my car immediately. They could hear the engine from blocks away, and they started converging on my location from all directions. Some of them were fast enough to keep pace with my car when I had to slow down for obstacles. A few times, infected people jumped onto my hood, tried to break through my windows. I drove toward the highway on ramps, hoping to get out of the city before the infected could surround me completely. But when I reached Lakeshore Drive, I found it blocked by military vehicles. Soldiers had established a checkpoint, and they weren't letting anyone through without authorization. I had to make a split-second decision. Try to convince the soldiers to let me pass, or find another route out of the city. I chose to approach the checkpoint because I was running out of time and options. Dawn was only a few hours away, and the military sanitization would begin whether I was out of the city or not. The soldiers at the checkpoint were nervous and heavily armed. They ordered me out of my car at gunpoint and demanded to know where I'd come from and where I was going. I told them the truth about escaping from downtown and trying to reach safety outside the city. They examined me for bite marks and signs of infection. They took my temperature and checked my eyes with flashlights. The whole process felt more like a medical examination than a security screening. They were clearly following protocols designed to prevent infected people from escaping the quarantine zone. After examining me, the sergeant in charge told me that civilians were being evacuated to temporary camps outside the city. He gave me directions to an evacuation point about 10 miles north of Chicago. He also gave me an official pass that would allow me to travel through other military checkpoints. But then he told me something that changed everything. The evacuation camps weren't temporary shelters. They were processing centers where civilians would be screened and classified for relocation to permanent facilities. Some people would be sent to work camps. Others would be sent to resettlement areas. A few would be selected for special programs. The sergeant wouldn't explain what the special programs were, but his tone made it clear that not everyone who entered the camps would be leaving them. The government was using the infection crisis as an opportunity to implement some kind of population control system. I thanked the sergeant and drove toward the evacuation point, but I had no intention of going there. Instead, I planned to drive past it and keep heading west until I reached my uncle's farm in DeKalb County. My uncle had always been suspicious of government authority, and he'd prepared his property for various disaster scenarios. As I drove through the suburbs north of Chicago, I could see that the infection had spread much farther than the news. Our reports had indicated there were fires burning in residential neighborhoods. Emergency vehicles were abandoned on suburban streets. Some entire subdivisions were dark and silent. I also started seeing military vehicles and aircraft everywhere. This wasn't just a local response to the Chicago outbreak. This was a coordinated national operation that had been planned in advance. The government had been preparing for this crisis long before it happened. Around 4 o'clock in the morning, I heard radio transmissions that confirmed my worst fears. The military wasn't just sanitizing downtown Chicago. They were preparing to sanitize multiple metropolitan areas across the country. Detroit, Milwaukee, Indianapolis, and at least a dozen other cities were scheduled for the same treatment. Someone had used the infection crisis to justify destroying America's major population centers. Millions of people were going to die, not from the infection, but from the government's response to the infection. This wasn't about public health. This was about reshaping society according to someone's predetermined plan. I realized that escaping Chicago was just the beginning of my survival challenge. The real threat wasn't the infected people I'd left behind in the city. The real threat was the system that had created this crisis and was now using it to implement a new form of control over the population. As I approached the outskirts of DeKalb County, I could see military roadblocks being established on all the major highways. They were creating a perimeter around the entire region, not just around the infected cities. No one was going to be allowed to move freely anymore. I had to abandon the main roads and find back country routes to reach my uncle's farm. The government pass the sergeant had given me was becoming more dangerous than helpful. Anyone carrying official documentation would be tracked and monitored by the new system being implemented. When I finally turned onto the gravel road leading to my uncle's property, I could see smoke rising from his chimney. He was awake, probably monitoring emergency radio frequencies and preparing for whatever was coming next. I was about to discover that my escape from Chicago was just the first phase of a much larger struggle for survival. My uncle's farm sat on 40 acres of land that he'd been preparing for disaster scenarios since the 1990s. When I pulled into his driveway at 5 in the morning, he was already waiting for me on his front porch with a rifle in his hands. He'd heard my car coming from a mile away, and in the current situation, unannounced visitors could be dangerous. Uncle Tom was my father's older brother, a former Marine who'd served 2 tours in Vietnam before coming home to become a farmer. He'd never trusted the government, and he'd spent decades building what he called a sustainable survival compound. Solar panels, wind turbines, water wells, food storage, ammunition stockpiles, and communication equipment that could reach other prepared families across the Midwest. When he saw it was me, he lowered his rifle but didn't relax completely. He examined me for bite marks and signs of infection before letting me out of my car. He'd been monitoring emergency radio frequencies all night, and he knew exactly what was happening in Chicago and the other affected cities. Tom told me that the infection outbreak was just the beginning of something much larger. He'd been tracking unusual government activity for months before the crisis began. Military units moving into position around major cities. Emergency supplies being stockpiled at undisclosed locations. Communication networks being tested and secured. He showed me documents he'd collected from various sources, including some government employees who shared his suspicions about official preparations. The documents suggested that certain agencies had been planning for a population reduction event for over a year. The infection crisis provided the perfect justification for implementing those plans. Tom's property had everything needed for long-term survival. He generated his own electricity, grew his own food, and had enough stored supplies to last several years. But more importantly, he was connected to a network of like-minded families who'd been preparing for exactly this kind of scenario. His radio equipment allowed him to communicate with other survival groups across multiple states. Through these communications, he'd learned that the infection outbreak was much more widespread than official reports indicated. Cities in Texas, California, Florida, and the Northeast were experiencing similar crises. The government was implementing sanitization protocols in all of these areas. But Tom had also learned something that the mainstream media wasn't reporting. The infection had a cure. Government scientists had developed an effective treatment within hours of the outbreak beginning. The treatment was being administered to selected individuals, primarily government officials, military personnel, and people deemed essential for the new social order being implemented. The fact that a cure existed but wasn't being distributed to the general population proved that this crisis was intentional. Someone wanted millions of people to die or be displaced. Someone was using biological warfare against their own population to achieve political objectives. Tom introduced me to other members of his survival network through secure radio communications. There was a group of families in Wisconsin who'd established a safe zone around an abandoned military base. A community in Iowa that was protecting their small town from both infected and government forces. Even some military units that had gone rogue rather than participate in the sanitization operations. Through these communications, I learned that resistance movements were forming throughout the country. People who understood that the real threat wasn't the infection, but the system using the infection to destroy American society. These groups were sharing information, coordinating activities, and preparing to fight back against what they recognized as a coordinated attack on the population. Tom showed me surveillance footage he'd captured of military operations in the region. Convoys of vehicles moving equipment that had nothing to do with medical response or infection control. Construction teams building new facilities that looked more like detention centers than relief camps. Aircraft spraying unknown substances over rural areas where no infection had been reported. The most disturbing footage showed military personnel removing children from families at evacuation centers. Parents were told the children needed special medical screening, but the children never returned. When parents asked questions, they were detained or disappeared entirely. Tom explained that the government's long-term plan involved more than just destroying cities. They were implementing a complete reorganization of American society. The surviving population would be sorted into categories based on their usefulness to the new system. Skilled workers would be sent to labor camps. Intellectuals and potential troublemakers would be eliminated. Children would be raised in government facilities to become loyal servants of the new order. This wasn't just a response to a biological crisis. This was the implementation of a totalitarian system that had been planned for decades. The infection outbreak was simply the trigger event that allowed them to declare martial law and suspend constitutional rights indefinitely. Through his network contacts, Tom learned that similar operations were being conducted in other countries. The biological attack hadn't been limited to the United States. Major cities in Canada, Mexico, and several European nations were experiencing identical crises simultaneously. This was a coordinated global operation designed to collapse existing governments and replace them with a unified control system. Tom had been tracking the individuals and organizations behind this operation for years. A coalition of wealthy elites, government officials, and corporate leaders who believed that democracy and individual freedom were obstacles to efficient global management. They called themselves the Renewal Council, and they'd been working toward this moment since the early 2000s. The Renewal Council believed that the world's population needed to be reduced to sustainable levels and that survivors needed to be managed through a centralized authority. They saw the infection crisis as a humane way to achieve these goals without the messy politics of traditional warfare or economic collapse. But their plan had a weakness. They needed skilled individuals to maintain the infrastructure and technology required for their new society. Many of the people they needed were among the populations they were trying to eliminate. This created opportunities for resistance movements to recruit valuable allies and acquire critical resources. Tom showed me his plans for joining the resistance. Network. His farm would become a safe house for refugees escaping the government's processing centers. His communication equipment would coordinate with other groups to share intelligence and plan operations. His weapons and supplies would support teams working to sabotage the Renewal Council's infrastructure. But first, I needed to understand the scope of what we were fighting against. Tom gave me access to his intelligence files, and what I learned was terrifying. The Renewal Council had infiltrated government agencies, military commands, and corporate leadership at the highest levels. They controlled media outlets, technology companies, and financial institutions. They'd been preparing for this operation for over 20 years. The biological weapon they'd used wasn't just designed to kill people. It was designed to create social chaos that would justify extreme government responses. The infected weren't actually dead. They were alive but controlled by the pathogen, which was engineered to respond to specific electromagnetic frequencies. The Renewal Council could direct the behavior of infected populations using transmitted signals. This meant that the infected attacks weren't random. They were directed towards specific targets that the Renewal Council wanted to eliminate. Political dissidents, religious leaders, community organizers, and anyone else who might oppose the new system were being specifically targeted by controlled infected populations. Tom showed me electromagnetic frequency detectors that proved this theory. Every major infected attack corresponded with specific radio transmissions from government facilities. The infected were being used as biological weapons, guided by remote control technology. The cure for the infection was actually quite simple. It involved disrupting the electromagnetic control signals and administering a basic antiviral medication. But the Renewal Council was suppressing this information to maintain the crisis that justified their takeover of society. Through his network, Tom had obtained samples of the antiviral medication. His group was planning to distribute the cure to infected populations and reveal the truth about electromagnetic control to the general public. But they needed more people with technical skills and access to communication systems. That's where I came in. My background in marketing and technology made me valuable for information warfare against the Renewal Council. I could help create and distribute content that exposed their operations to people who didn't understand what was really happening. Tom explained that the next phase of the resistance would involve 3 primary objectives. First, rescue as many people as possible from government processing centers before they were permanently relocated or eliminated. Second, establish independent communities that could survive without relying on government-controlled infrastructure. Third, document and expose the Renewal Council's operations to create popular resistance to their authority. Each objective required different skills and resources. Rescue operations needed military expertise and weapons. Independent communities needed agricultural and technical knowledge. Information warfare needed communication systems and media production capabilities. I realized that my escape from Chicago was just the beginning of my involvement in this larger conflict. I couldn't just hide on Tom's farm and wait for the crisis to pass. The crisis wasn't going to pass. It was the new permanent reality unless people like us fought back against the system creating it. Tom introduced me to other resistance members through secure video communications. There was a former CDC scientist who'd been fired for asking questions about the biological weapons development. A military intelligence officer who'd uncovered evidence of the Renewal Council's infiltration of government agencies. A technology executive who discovered that social media platforms were being used to identify and target potential dissidents. Each of these individuals had risked everything to oppose the Renewal Council's plans. Some had lost their families. Others had been forced to abandon their careers and live in hiding. All of them understood that this fight was about more than just surviving the infection crisis. It was about preserving human freedom and dignity against a system designed to eliminate both. The scientist explained that the biological weapon could be completely neutralized if we could access and destroy the electromagnetic transmission facilities controlling infected populations. The military officer provided intelligence about government operations and weak points in their security systems. The technology executive offered to help us establish secure communication networks that couldn't be monitored or shut down by authorities. Over the next several hours, I learned about resistance operations happening throughout the country. Teams were infiltrating government facilities to rescue detained civilians. Others were establishing independent communication networks to coordinate activities between scattered groups. Some were working to capture and reprogram the electromagnetic transmission systems to free infected populations from government control. Tom showed me my sister Sarah's name on a list of medical personnel who'd been detained rather than killed during the hospital takeovers. She was alive, but she was being held at a government facility where medical professionals were being forced to participate in the Renewal Council's biological weapons research. Rescuing her would require a coordinated operation involving multiple resistance groups. This information changed everything for me. I'd assumed Sarah was dead, and I'd been focused on my own survival. Now I learned that she was alive but trapped in a situation where her medical knowledge was being used to harm other people. I couldn't abandon her to that fate. Tom explained that rescue operations were extremely dangerous and had low success rates. Government facilities were heavily guarded and designed to prevent exactly this kind of infiltration. But the resistance had developed strategies and acquired resources that made such operations possible under the right circumstances. The key was coordinating multiple simultaneous attacks on different targets to divide government attention and resources. While one team rescued detained personnel from a medical facility, other teams would attack communication centers, supply depots, and administrative offices. The government couldn't effectively defend against coordinated attacks on multiple fronts. I volunteered to participate in the operation to rescue Sarah and other medical personnel. My knowledge of Chicago geography and my motivation to save my sister made me valuable for the planning phase. Tom agreed to include me in the mission, but he insisted that I undergo survival and combat training before participating in any actual operations. The training took place at a hidden facility on another resistance member's property. Former military personnel taught me basic weapons handling, tactical movement, and survival skills. I learned how to operate radios, treat injuries, and evade government surveillance. Most importantly, I learned how to function as part of a team under extreme stress. During training, I met other civilians who joined the resistance after losing family members to government operations. Their stories were similar to mine. Normal people who'd been forced to become fighters because the system had declared war on their existence. We learned that the Renewal Council's plans extended far beyond the current crisis. They intended to maintain the infection threat indefinitely as justification for permanent martial law. Anyone who opposed their authority would be classified as infected and targeted for elimination. Democratic institutions would be permanently suspended in favor of technocratic management by approved experts. The resistance wasn't just fighting to end the current crisis. We were fighting to prevent the establishment of a permanent totalitarian system that would control every aspect of human life for generations to come. This was our last chance to preserve the possibility of freedom for our children and grandchildren. Tom received intelligence that the facility holding Sarah and other medical personnel was scheduled for transfer to a more secure location within the next week. If we were going to rescue them, we had to act immediately. The mission would be dangerous, but waiting would make rescue impossible. I realized that everything I'd experienced in those first 12 hours of the outbreak had prepared me for this moment. Escaping from my apartment building had taught me to think quickly under pressure. Navigating through downtown Chicago had shown me how to move through dangerous territory. Reaching Tom's farm had connected me with people who understood the real nature of the threat we were facing. The next phase of my story would determine whether the resistance could successfully fight back against the Renewal Council's plans, whether we could rescue the people they detained and expose the truth about their operations, whether we could preserve some possibility of freedom in a world they were trying to completely control. As I prepared for the rescue mission, I understood that I was no longer just a survivor of the Chicago outbreak. I was a member of a resistance movement, fighting for the future of human civilization itself.